The flickering light of a single candle barely cut through the thick, oppressive darkness of the cave. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting across the damp stone walls as the muffled groans of the wounded filled the air. Outside, the battle raged relentlessly, but within these underground corridors near Cherbourg, the war took on a different, almost unbearable intensity. German nurses moved silently, their white coats smudged with dirt and blood, each step a careful negotiation with exhaustion and fear. Supplies were scarce, morphine measured drop by drop. Bandages boiled, dried, and reused, and every antiseptic wipe was a treasure. They had been trained to save lives, to fight infection and pain. But here, their skills were tested not by technique alone, but by an unrelenting shortage that forced them to improvise with what little they had. In this grim, subterranean world, survival was a matter of ingenuity. A torn sheet became a makeshift sling, a cracked bottle a container for a precious antibiotic. Every decision carried weight. One misstep could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers depending on them. Yet even as they struggled against the material scarcity, the emotional burden was just as heavy. These nurses had been raised to believe in the might and superiority of their nation, taught that the enemy was cruel and incapable of compassion. And now, as they navigated the suffocating corridors of the cave hospital, their beliefs offered no comfort, only the stark reality of relentless human suffering and the constant reminder of how fragile life truly was. Despite the darkness and the rationed supplies, moments of quiet bravery shone through. A nurse would cradle a feverish soldier, whispering reassurances even as her own hands trembled. Another would carefully sterilize instruments with makeshift methods, improvising a solution that might hold for just long enough to perform the necessary surgery. Their resilience was remarkable, but it was born of desperation, not choice, a testament to the human spirit enduring under the harshest conditions imaginable. And yet, this story is more than a tale of scarcity and struggle. It is the beginning of a journey, one that will challenge everything these women thought they knew about their profession, their enemies, and the world beyond the cave. Because what awaited them outside was not the devastation they expected, but a revelation so profound that it would transform not only their understanding of medicine, but their very understanding of humanity. If you are fascinated by stories of courage, resilience, and unexpected discovery, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the incredible journey that unfolds when these German nurses step into a world they never imagined. This is a story of transformation, a story of compassion meeting ideology, and a story that proves how perspective can change everything. Stay with us, because what comes next will reveal a side of World War II that few have ever seen. As the heavy cave doors creaked open, the nurses blinked against the sudden, unforgiving light, their eyes adjusting from the dim, flickering shadows that had defined their world for so long. The air outside was sharp, clean, and unfamiliar, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of equipment and the distant, ordered sounds of an army moving with precision. Their hands, still trembling from weeks of exhaustion and fear, were raised in surrender, yet the tension that had gripped their muscles began to ebb as they were met not with anger or violence, but with calm, measured gestures that conveyed efficiency and care. American soldiers guided them through a series of procedures that seemed almost ritualistic in their organization, a stark contrast to the chaos and scarcity of the underground hospital they had just left, where every drop of morphine was rationed and every bandage salvaged from previous use. For the nurses, each step of this process felt like a contradiction of everything they had been taught, a living challenge to the rigid structure of beliefs instilled in them over years of ideological education. They were led to examination rooms where every instrument gleamed, where stethoscopes, thermometers, and blood pressure cuffs were handled with meticulous precision, and where their own ailments, fatigue, and injuries were noted with the same concern shown for the wounded soldiers they had cared for so relentlessly. The attention to detail, the patience, and the unwavering respect for human life struck them with the force of a revelation. These were the enemy, the nation they had been taught to fear and despise. Yet here they were demonstrating not only professionalism but a profound humanity that seemed almost alien in its consistency. Every movement and procedure became a lesson, one that dismantled the mental architecture built from years of indoctrination. They witnessed orderly lines of treatment, where patient's friend and foe alike were triaged and cared for with equal diligence, and where the abundance of resources allowed for a level of care that the nurses had thought unimaginable. Supplies were not hoarded out of necessity, but used with purpose and without hesitation. Bandages were clean and plentiful, medications administered according to best practices, and the operating rooms illuminated with bright, even lighting that left no corner of infection unchecked. The nurses could hardly reconcile the sight of patients receiving full attention, their needs anticipated and met, with the stories of American incompetence and decadence that had filled their textbooks and lectures. Beyond the physical abundance, it was the philosophy underlying the care that unsettled them most. Here, hierarchy did not dictate silence. Nurses were encouraged to speak, to question, and to make decisions for the good of the patient. Ethical responsibility took precedence over blind obedience, a concept that challenged every assumption they had held about duty, loyalty, and authority. Each nurse faced the silent question of what it meant to serve life rather than ideology, and the answer presented itself not through lectures or arguments but through daily, observable practice. The world outside the cave was not merely better supplied. It was fundamentally organized around the principle that every human life deserved respect, attention, and compassion, a principle so foreign that it seemed almost revolutionary. The nurses observed further anomalies that shook their preconceptions. Black American nurses moved confidently among the ranks, providing instruction, care, and oversight without hesitation or deferment. A scenario that collided directly with the racial doctrines they had been taught to accept unquestioningly. They witnessed patients treated without regard to nationality, race, or previous allegiance, and acts of kindness from a warm meal to a small gift of chocolate performed without expectation of repayment or propaganda value. Every gesture, every detail of care, accumulated into a quiet but relentless confrontation with their prior understanding of the world, and with each passing day, the psychological walls of prejudice, fear, and unquestioned loyalty began to crumble. On board the Liberty ships and later within the sprawling U.S. camps, this immersion continued. Nurses who had endured weeks of rationed supplies and constant fear now walked through medical wards stocked with the tools they had only read about in textbooks, from sterilized surgical instruments to properly preserved blood plasma. Operating theaters were bright and fully equipped. Staff worked in synchrony, and even the most routine procedures were executed with a sense of precision and purpose that bordered on artistry. Their professional instincts were challenged and expanded simultaneously. What they had considered improvisation born of necessity was here replaced by systematic mastery, where every action was calculated to preserve life and prevent suffering to the highest degree possible. Through these experiences, the nurses' understanding of care, of medical practice, and of the moral responsibilities inherent in their profession began to shift irrevocably. The abundance, the organization, the egalitarian treatment, and the ethical framework they witnessed forced a confrontation with their indoctrinated beliefs, demanding reflection. adaptation, and ultimately, transformation. Each day offered a new insight, a new contradiction to their former assumptions, until the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The reality of human, well-resourced, and ethically grounded medical care was not only achievable, it was the standard these nurses had now encountered firsthand. By the time they would be returned to Germany, these women were no longer merely observers, they were participants in a system that had reshaped their understanding of duty, compassion, and professional integrity. The journey from the darkness of the cave to the bright, orderly wards of the American medical system was more than a physical passage. It was a voyage into a new paradigm of ethics, humanity, and excellence in medicine. Their story stands as a powerful testament to the idea that exposure, experience, and careful guidance can dismantle even the most deeply ingrained beliefs, revealing the possibility of transformation where once there was only indoctrination. As the German nurses were moved from the heat of Tunisia to the open decks of the Liberty ships, the world they had known, the one forged in shadows, fear, and scarcity, began to unravel in ways they could scarcely comprehend. The processing of prisoners of war in North Africa had already planted the first seeds of cognitive dissonance, where efficiency, order, and respect for individuals contradicted every lesson they had been taught about the supposed degeneracy and cruelty of the American enemy. Yet it was on the ships, as the ocean stretched endlessly around them, and the rhythmic motion of the hull contrasted sharply with the turmoil in their minds, that the full magnitude of their journey began to reveal itself. Here, in this floating city of care and precision, they encountered surgical theaters that glowed with consistent electric light, instruments sterilized to a level they had only dreamed of, and supplies that seemed almost limitless compared to the rationed chaos of their former cave hospitals. Each day aboard the ship unfolded like a carefully orchestrated demonstration of what medicine could be when unshackled from the constraints of war-driven scarcity. The nurses, many of whom had served in the field with nothing more than candlelight and boiled bandages, observed the meticulous attention given to every procedure. They watched as blood plasma was stored under controlled temperatures, ready for transfusions that could mean the difference between life and death. While antibiotics, previously rationed grain by grain in their own experience, were applied liberally to wounds to prevent infection before it could take hold, the contrast was staggering. What had once been a desperate improvisation, a constant negotiation with mortality, was now a systematized symphony of care where every step was designed to maximize survival and minimize suffering. As they moved from deck to deck, witnessing patients receiving attention from well-trained, disciplined teams, a growing sense of awe began to mingle with a creeping unease. They were beginning to see that their previous understanding of the world, of enemies, and of the limits of medicine was incomplete. Upon arrival in the United States, the nurses were transported to sprawling camps that operated with a level of organization and professionalism far beyond anything they had previously imagined. These were not the rudimentary, overcrowded facilities of wartime Europe, but fully equipped centers where every detail of patient care was considered and executed with precision. Operating rooms were fitted with adjustable lights that eliminated shadows, sterilization autoclaves that could prepare instruments in minutes, and surgical tools maintained in pristine condition. Each nurse was introduced not merely to procedures, but to an underlying philosophy that placed patient outcomes above hierarchy, ideology, or routine, challenging the very foundation of their previous training. The rigor and discipline of these medical practices contrasted sharply with the improvisational methods they had relied upon, revealing a system that valued preparation, planning, and ethical responsibility in equal measure. Even the most routine aspects of care were imbued with meaning. Wounds were cleaned and dressed with care. Infections treated swiftly with medications previously unimaginable in their cave hospitals. And nutritional needs met in ways that ensured recovery rather than mere survival. They saw how carefully calibrated doses, proper sanitation, and systematic observation could transform outcomes, saving limbs and lives that would have been lost under the conditions they had endured. The nurses were forced to reconcile the reality of abundance and expertise with the indoctrination that had painted the Americans as weak, chaotic, or incapable of sustained competence. Each observation challenged assumptions, reshaped expectations, and slowly dismantled the rigid worldview that had defined their professional and personal lives for years. What further unsettled the nurses was the human dimension of this care. The American medical personnel they encountered treated every patient with dignity, regardless of nationality, rank, or race. Black nurses worked alongside white colleagues, taking supervisory and instructional roles without hesitation. A scenario that directly contradicted the racial hierarchy that had been instilled in them since childhood. Acts of kindness, from attentive listening to gestures as small as providing reading materials or comfort items, demonstrated a commitment to humanity that transcended the political and military conflict that had brought them here. This was care that sought not only to preserve life, but to honor it, and the cumulative effect was a profound questioning of previous assumptions about enemies, ethics, and the purpose of medicine itself. The integration of education with practice became a continuous revelation. Nurses were introduced to techniques for emergency response, infection control, mass vaccination, and public health that were not merely theoretical but applied in real time. The rigorous training emphasized problem solving, ethical responsibility, and critical thinking in ways that had been absent in the hierarchical, ideologically constrained system of Nazi Germany. They were encouraged to question, debate, and innovate, to take ownership of patient outcomes rather than defer blindly to authority. Each day brought lessons that extended beyond the mechanics of care into the philosophy underpinning it, demonstrating how a society could marshal resources, expertise, and compassion to achieve results far beyond the limited scope of wartime improvisation. By the time these nurses completed their time in U.S. camps, they had not only mastered advanced techniques and procedures, but had undergone a transformation in perspective. Their understanding of medicine, professional responsibility, and the moral obligations inherent in care had been profoundly reshaped. The journey from the caves of Cherbourg to the organized wards of Liberty ships and American camps was not merely a physical relocation. It was an education in the power of abundance, organization, and ethical practice. What had once been survival under scarcity became mastery under possibility. And the lessons learned in these environments would go on to influence the rebuilding of medical systems in a devastated post-war Germany, planting seeds of modern, ethical, and inclusive healthcare practices that extended far beyond the immediate context of their captivity. As the German nurses settled into the rhythm of life within the sprawling U.S. camps, they began to notice nuances that no textbook or propaganda poster could have prepared them for. At first, the abundance of supplies, the efficiency of operations, and the clinical precision had been almost enough to overwhelm their senses. But it was the subtler, human elements of care that began to erode the ideological framework they had carried like armor for so many years. They observed nurses of different backgrounds working side by side, collaborating seamlessly on tasks that demanded focus, skill, and attention to detail. Black nurses supervised wards, directed procedures, and offered guidance with a confidence and authority that contradicted the rigid, racially segregated hierarchies ingrained into the German nursing system under the Nazi regime. For women who had been taught from childhood that racial purity and strict obedience defined both morality and professional competence. This simple, unassuming demonstration of equality was revolutionary. It did not arrive as a lecture or a confrontational argument. It appeared in everyday actions, in the calm assurance of instruction, in the respect shown to every colleague regardless of skin color, and in the patient-first ethos that permeated the camps. Even the smallest gestures were laden with meaning. A nurse might pass a tray of food or clean linens without regard to who would receive it, or a physician would pause to answer a question patiently, creating an environment where questioning and discussion were not only allowed but encouraged. These acts of kindness and ethical responsibility over hierarchy presented a living contradiction to the rigid doctrines of loyalty, obedience, and racial supremacy that the German nurses had internalized. They were confronted by the dissonance of a world in which human worth was not predetermined by race, nationality, or allegiance, but was recognized through competence, empathy, and shared professional responsibility. In observing these interactions, the nurses began to perceive that the foundation of the system they had served, the one that celebrated conformity, hierarchy, and exclusion, was not the only path to order, discipline, or moral purpose. The daily reality of the camps slowly worked on their consciousness. Where once they had adhered strictly to chain of command and unquestioning obedience, they now saw decision-making as a shared responsibility. The patient's welfare was the ultimate priority, and every nurse, regardless of rank or background, had a role in safeguarding it. This concept was reinforced repeatedly, not through indoctrination but through practice. Nurses saw that when someone spoke up about a patient's deteriorating condition, their intervention could save a life. Conversely, silence could cost it. The idea that professional and moral accountability could exist independently of hierarchy was both liberating and destabilizing. It forced each woman to reconcile her previous understanding of duty with a new, evidence-based philosophy that placed the patient and the ethical execution of care above obedience to authority or ideology. Equally transformative were the moments of human kindness that defied all expectations. Churches sent choirs to sing for the prisoners. Local communities offered gifts and comforts. And even simple gestures like being given chocolate or warm clothing carried the weight of moral demonstration. Each act directly contradicted the narrative they had absorbed, that their enemies were decadent, selfish, or incapable of compassion. Instead, these acts showed thoughtfulness, foresight, and empathy as guiding principles, revealing a culture where the enemy could act with generosity, decency, and principle. The juxtaposition was jarring. The nurses who had witnessed the horrors of a regime that exploited medical knowledge to perpetuate suffering were now seeing care, equity, and moral responsibility in action at every level. Beyond individual kindness, the structure of the camps and the organization of care reinforced the principle that competence and fairness mattered more than social or racial hierarchies. African American nurses, once relegated in their training to segregated and inferior roles by Nazi racial ideology, were fully integrated into the work, often teaching, supervising, and making critical decisions in patient care. This exposure dismantled years of racist indoctrination, as the German nurses could no longer deny that skill, knowledge, and humanity existed independently of color. Each day, they witnessed a system where inclusivity and meritocracy guided medical practice, and with each observation, the ideological walls constructed over a lifetime of propaganda cracked a little more. Their own roles evolved in response. Where before they had acted under rigid instructions and expectations defined by nationality and ideology, they now exercised judgment, compassion, and ethical responsibility. They learned to value dialogue, critical thinking, and moral courage as essential tools in the practice of medicine, realizing that adherence to hierarchy alone could no longer define competence or morality. The integration of professional equality, patient-centered care, and everyday kindness illustrated a philosophy of medicine and, by extension, of society that stood in direct opposition to the world they had left behind in Europe. As the weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of these experiences became undeniable. The nurse's worldview, once tightly bound by the doctrines of racial superiority, blind obedience, and utilitarian exploitation, was transformed by the quiet power of example. They internalized lessons not through force or argument, but through lived experience, observing fairness in practice, witnessing equality across racial and professional lines, and participating in a system that valued ethical responsibility over hierarchical command. What they saw and experienced became a profound moral education, one that challenged the assumptions of a lifetime and demonstrated that compassion, justice, and competence could coexist, not as ideals, but as practical, observable realities. In the end, the transformation of these German nurses was as much about the human spirit as it was about medicine. They learned that healing extended beyond physical intervention, encompassing respect, empathy, and equality, and that true professionalism demanded courage to act ethically, even when it contradicted prior teachings. Their exposure to racial equality, ethical responsibility, and consistent acts of kindness did more than teach new skills. It reconstructed their understanding of humanity itself, revealing a world where moral clarity and compassion could thrive even amid the remnants of war. As the German nurses settled into the structured environment of the U.S. prisoner of war camps, what began as a simple observation of abundance and humane treatment gradually evolved into a profound educational journey, one that would redefine their understanding of medicine, ethics, and professional responsibility. The initial shock of well-stocked hospitals, advanced surgical instruments, and meticulous patient care had already unsettled their assumptions. But it was the deliberate, carefully structured training programs introduced by American medical personnel that initiated the deepest transformation. Unlike the rigid, hierarchical instruction they had known in Germany, where obedience and conformity were paramount and questioning authority was discouraged, the educational model in these camps emphasized active engagement, problem-solving, and ethical reasoning. Lectures were accompanied by hands-on demonstrations. Discussions encouraged critical inquiry, and every aspect of learning was tied directly to real-world applications in patient care. For nurses who had been conditioned to follow orders unquestioningly, this was not merely a different approach. It was a revelation that challenged the very foundation of their professional identity. The curriculum itself was exhaustive and forward-thinking, covering not only surgical procedures and emergency care but also public health strategies, sanitation, epidemic control, nutrition, and preventive medicine. Nurses who had previously struggled to make do with meager supplies and improvised techniques were now learning to anticipate challenges, deploy resources efficiently, and apply scientific principles to safeguard large populations. They studied mass vaccination protocols, water purification methods, and strategies to combat malnutrition, all within the controlled, well-resourced environment of the camps. The logic and clarity behind these practices stood in stark contrast to the improvisational, ration-driven approach they had known in German field hospitals, and each new lesson carried with it a subtle but undeniable critique of the systems and ideologies they had served. Equally significant was the emphasis on critical thinking and moral responsibility. In the American model, ethical judgment was inseparable from technical competence. A nurse's duty extended beyond mere adherence to orders or rote application of techniques. They were taught to evaluate patient conditions independently, to speak up if a treatment plan was insufficient or harmful, and to weigh the outcomes of their actions with both scientific and humanitarian considerations in mind. This represented a seismic shift for the German nurses, who had been trained within a system that subordinated patient welfare to ideology, rank, and rigid hierarchy. The experience forced them to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. Could their loyalty to authority ever be reconciled with the imperative to save lives? How could they apply their skills in a manner that honored the dignity of every individual, rather than the ambitions of a regime? Practical exercises reinforced these lessons in ways that theoretical instruction never could. In simulated wards and during supervised treatment of both fellow prisoners and American patients, the nurses were challenged to apply what they had learned in complex, dynamic scenarios. They observed how careful monitoring, precise use of medication, and adherence to hygiene protocols dramatically reduced infections and improved outcomes, often saving limbs or lives that would have been lost under the improvised conditions of European battlefields. Each success, each measured improvement in patient recovery, served as empirical evidence that the philosophy underpinning American medical practice, combining scientific rigor with ethical accountability, was not only effective but superior to the systems they had inherited. Moreover, the training extended beyond individual competence to encompass public health thinking, instilling in the nurses an understanding of how medicine operated at a societal level. They studied the logistics of supply chains, the management of resources across multiple facilities, and strategies to prevent disease outbreaks within large populations, whether in military or civilian contexts. This systemic approach contrasted sharply with the fragmented, reactive, and often fatalistic mindset they had been taught to accept as inevitable in wartime Europe. They began to recognize that medicine was not merely a collection of techniques, but a philosophy that required foresight, planning, and an unwavering commitment to the well-being of all. The ethical dimension of the training was equally transformative. By observing and participating in a system where care was administered without prejudice and every individual was treated with dignity, the nurses confronted the moral failings of the regime they had served. The lessons were both professional and personal. Technical skill alone was insufficient. True nursing required moral courage, empathy, and an understanding that the purpose of medicine was to heal, not to enforce ideology or hierarchy. They learned that questioning orders, advocating for patients, and exercising judgment were not acts of defiance but essential components of competent, humane care. Each day spent in this environment reinforced the idea that ethical responsibility was inseparable from professional excellence, and that the two together could produce outcomes far beyond what obedience alone could achieve. By the time the nurses were preparing to return to Germany, the transformation was profound. They had acquired advanced technical skills, a deep understanding of public health principles, and an entirely new conception of professional ethics. More importantly, they had internalized a philosophy of care that prioritized human dignity, critical reasoning, and evidence-based practice over ideology or blind obedience. The education they received in the camps had not simply filled gaps in their knowledge. It had reconstructed their worldview, creating practitioners capable of shaping a post-war medical system rooted in science, compassion, and ethical responsibility. In confronting abundance, efficiency, and humanity in practice, the German nurses were irrevocably changed, carrying home lessons that would ripple outward through the reconstruction of a shattered nation's healthcare, influencing countless lives and redefining what it meant to serve as a medical professional in the modern world. As the war finally drew to a close and the guns fell silent across Europe, the German nurses who had journeyed from the dark, cramped cave hospitals of Cherbourg to the ordered, well-resourced camps of the United States found themselves preparing to return to a homeland that was almost unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, and the very institutions that had once guided medical practice had been dismantled or perverted by years of ideology-driven policies. Yet within this landscape of devastation, these women carried something more powerful than rubble or broken equipment. They carried knowledge, experience, and a new philosophy of care that had the potential to reshape the very foundations of German medicine. Their journey had not only taught them the practicalities of advanced medical treatment and public health, but had instilled in them a deep understanding of ethical responsibility, critical thinking, and the importance of human dignity in every patient interaction. Upon their return, they immediately recognized the scale of the task ahead. Hospitals had been bombed, supply chains were non-existent, and many of their colleagues had been lost to war or persecution. Yet, equipped with the techniques and approaches learned in American camps, these nurses became catalysts for reconstruction. They applied advanced surgical practices, proper sterilization procedure, and systematic patient care in environments where chaos had previously dominated. Where scarcity had once dictated every decision, they now demonstrated that resourcefulness and careful planning could restore functionality, even under difficult conditions. They trained fellow nurses and medical staff, sharing lessons in modern medicine, infection control, and patient-centered care, ensuring that knowledge would not remain isolated but could propagate throughout the recovering healthcare system. Equally transformative was the ethical framework they brought with them. In a post-war Germany still grappling with the moral consequences of the Third Reich, the nurses embodied a philosophy of medicine that placed human life and dignity above ideology, hierarchy, or political loyalty. They challenged ingrained practices that had permitted neglect, abuse, or prejudice, introducing standards of equality, compassion, and accountability. Hospitals under their supervision became more than treatment centers. They became exemplars of ethical care, where decisions were guided by science, evidence, and empathy rather than doctrine or fear. The influence of these returning nurses extended far beyond immediate patient care, shaping the values and practices of entire institutions and inspiring a new generation of medical professionals to prioritize ethics alongside expertise. Public health initiatives were another arena in which their impact was felt. Drawing upon the training they had received in U.S. camps, they organized vaccination campaigns, implemented sanitation protocols, and developed strategies to manage malnutrition and disease in communities devastated by war. Their approach combined logistical planning with patient-centered attention, demonstrating that public health could be both systematic and humane. In doing, they helped prevent epidemics, reduce mortality, and lay the groundwork for a healthcare system that was resilient, ethical, and modern. Their work illustrated that recovery was not solely a matter of repairing buildings or replenishing supplies, but of instilling a culture of care that valued every individual and every life. Perhaps most remarkably, the personal transformations these nurses had undergone became a source of inspiration. Having witnessed firsthand the power of equality, kindness, and ethical responsibility, they modeled these principles in every interaction. Junior nurses, doctors, and even administrators learned that competence was inseparable from moral courage, that questioning inappropriate orders or practices was a duty, and that inclusivity strengthened institutions rather than weakening them. In this way, the ripple effects of their American training extended into the very ethos of post-war German medicine, influencing attitudes toward race, hierarchy, and professional accountability for decades to come. The story of these nurses is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of education and example. from the trenches of Cherbourg to the camps and hospitals of the United States, and finally back to a devastated Germany. Their journey illustrates that even in the aftermath of conflict and indoctrination, change is possible, and that knowledge coupled with ethics can rebuild not only structures, but entire systems of care. Their legacy lives on in the hospitals they helped restore, the professionals they trained, and the countless patients whose lives were improved because of their commitment to excellence and humanity. Thank you for joining this journey into history, witnessing the remarkable transformation of these nurses, and seeing how courage, education, and compassion can triumph even in the darkest of times. If you found this story inspiring, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history, and share it with others who would appreciate the power of resilience and ethical action. By subscribing, you will join us in uncovering more extraordinary stories that reveal how human ingenuity, empathy, and moral courage can reshape our world even when faced with unimaginable challenges. Together, let us honor the lessons of the past and carry them forward into the future.